thanks everyone for joining. And before I dive in, I just want to thank all of the presenters for sharing their research using the poverty tracker data. Over the last 10 plus years, the poverty tracker has grown in many ways, and as a member of the team responsible for managing the data, it's exciting to see it being used alongside such creative methods to answer such a diverse set of questions. Our hope is that these presentations, along with the release of new waves of data and great documentation, will spur ideas among those studying poverty and well-being about how they can use the data to answer these questions that they're interested in. I also want to take a moment to thank those leading the project, the PIs and the other senior faculty members, as well as the sample management staff, including the dozens of research assistants, many of whom are undergraduate, master's, and doctoral students who are responsible for fielding the thousands of surveys that are collected each year. Without all of their sacrifice, time, and care, this amazing resource and the findings from it wouldn't be possible. Finally, I want to thank Sarah and the Robinhood team for being such great partners and for funding all of the work that goes into the poverty tracker. So while our hope with the first half of the day was to highlight the exciting and innovative ways the data can be used to answer a variety of questions, the goal for the rest of the day is to provide a better understanding of the poverty tracker data and the nuts and bolts of the project. We'll start with a general overview of the project, discussing the original goals of the project, the core measures and additional topics covered in the poverty tracker surveys, the various cohorts followed, and the timeline and evolution of the project. We'll also talk about the survey schedule and when specific topical modules are fielded. And finally, we'll review pooling various poverty tracker cohort data. From there, Yejun Jia, our resident statistician who guides our decisions on sampling and oversees the weighting and imputation methodology for the project, will discuss the process for producing the imputation of weights and how they should be used. And after that, Skylar Ross, our data manager who oversees the management of the data across all of the cohorts, will give an overview of the publicly available poverty tracker data and documentation, much of which is being released for the first time, as Sophie mentioned. And he'll also go over the process for requesting sensitive data that's not publicly available. And that includes either later waves of later cohorts of data that haven't been made publicly available yet, or sensitive data like the geographic data that Ethan used in his presentation. And then later we'll have a training where we kind of work with the data and just show you kind of how it's structured and kind of going over the variables and how to use the weights and those kind of things. So yeah, we'll start with the general overview of the project and begin with the original goals. So the poverty tracker was launched in 2012 in partnership with Robinhood with three main goals. The first goal was getting a better measure of poverty in New York City. Historically, since its development in the 1960s, the official poverty measure has been used by policymakers and researchers as the core measure for determining economic well-being. This measure of poverty is based on the cost of a minimum food diet and multiplied by 3 to account for other expenses such as housing and healthcare. In 2011, the U.S. Census Bureau developed a supplemental poverty measure, which improves on the official poverty measure to more accurately capture the two components of the poverty measure, those being income and expenses. This improvement is accomplished by considering taxes and transfers from the government, making regional cost of living adjustments, which is vitally important when you're looking at a city like New York City, and more accurately and comprehensively measuring expenses through the inclusion of those related to out-of-pocket medical costs, childcare expenses, and work-related expenses. While the current population survey produced by the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics created an SPM measure in their data set, the sample size is not quite large enough to look at smaller geographic designations, and thus an improved measure is not available in New York City on an annual basis. One of the main goals of the poverty tracker thus has been to provide such an estimate among a population representative of New Yorkers. While the SPM represents an improvement over the OPM, we know the poverty measure still faces limitations in its ability to capture all of the economic challenges that people face. For this reason, another goal of the project was to include alternative measures of disadvantage, such as material hardships and health disabilities, which you heard a little bit about before. Including these measures alongside the SPM allows researchers the ability to examine how the SPM and OPM relate to other measures of disadvantage. And finally, the third major goal of the project was to allow us to understand dynamics of poverty and disadvantage over time. The longitudinal structure of the project provides the ability to examine such experiences over time and how they respond to policy interventions, major life events, and changes in circumstances. And we've looked at a lot of these factors over the years as the poverty tracker has gone on. In line with these goals, we collect 3 core measures of disadvantage, which we mentioned. This includes our income poverty measure, our measure of material hardship, and a measure that captures severe health problems. Our core measure of poverty is that specified under the supplemental poverty measure. In addition to the supplemental poverty measure, the poverty tracker data includes a measure of official poverty, and all the individual components on both the income and expense side of these poverty measures are included in the public use poverty tracker data files. The poverty measures in the data are complemented by a measure of material hardship, which is defined as facing a challenge affording food, housing, utility payments, which are bills, a financial hardship, which is having enough money on a regular basis, and the medical care. So I'll go more into these and how they're measured in the next slide. So yeah, here we can see how the individual components of the material hardship measure are defined. Food hardship is defined as running out of food often, or often worrying food would run out without enough money to buy more. Housing hardship is defined as having to stay in a shelter or in another place not meant for regular housing, or having to move in with others due to the cost. Bill hardship is defined as having utilities cut off due to a lack of money. Financial hardship is defined as often running out of money between paychecks or pay cycles. And medical hardship is defined as not being able to see a medical professional due to the cost. And then the third core measure of disadvantage included in the poverty tracker is having a significant health problem. This measure is defined as a respondent saying they have poor health or a work-limiting health condition. In these next 2 slides, we just wanted to show a few results produced from these core measures that we produced over the years, and that accomplished these main goals of the project. In this figure, we overlay the different measures of disadvantage to show the share of the city who experienced each disadvantage and the share who overall experience any of these disadvantages. Figures from our first panel on an early report, so it's not super recent, but a good example of the different disadvantage measures in the data and how they compare to one another. So we can see in this file, we're using this data, 23% of New Yorkers fell under the supplemental poverty line, which is a little bit higher than under the official poverty line. But if we look at severe hardship, that's a much higher share of New Yorkers are facing this disadvantage. And when we compare all of the forms of disadvantage, more than half of New York City was facing any of these forms of disadvantage. And this is a figure from our more recent annual report that Sophie was presenting on. And I think that this is a great figure because it kind of just highlights the overlap of these forms of disadvantage and what share of New Yorkers are facing multiple disadvantages or all 3 disadvantages. In addition to our core measures, the poverty tracker includes a series of questions about changes and shocks that a respondent might have experienced. These include common life events like starting or losing a job, having a child, starting or ending a relationship, having benefits cut off, and other major life events that may impact an individual or family's economic well-being. And here's a finding from an annual report where we see an example of the relationship between some of these shocks and entrances into poverty. And we see that losing a job, ending a relationship, and having a child are all correlated with entering poverty. In addition to our core measures and the shocks, we have a wealth of information on a number of other topics that are collected through the poverty tracker surveys. Later on, we'll see where these happen in the survey schedule, but you can see that the poverty tracker captures the data on a wide breadth of topics beyond our core measures. And these may be interested widely to the research community. So now I'm just going to give a little bit of a background of the timeline of the project, the different cohorts we follow, and the evolution of the project. So as I mentioned, the study was launched in 2012 and surveys representative cohorts of New Yorkers multiple times a year for a period of up to 6 years. When the poverty tracker originally launched in 2012, the plan was to just survey for 2 years, but since then that has been extended to 6 years. Since the initial launch, the study has recruited 5 distinct samples of New Yorkers, which we refer to as cohorts 1 through 5. And we'll talk more about these in coming slides. Most of the samples were recruited through a random digit dial methodology, though we periodically include supplementary samples. This includes a supplementary sample of respondents recruited from social service agencies in the first 2 cohorts, and more recently, an oversample of New Yorkers of Chinese origin in the 4th and 5th cohorts. So now we'll go through the different cohorts and their timelines within the full study. So the first cohort was recruited in 2012, and respondents were interviewed for up to 2 years, with the final surveys launching in 2014. The sample size of this cohort is just over 2,200 New Yorkers. For the sample, about 2,000 were sampled through a random digit dial, and just over 200 were randomly selected social service participants. All survey waves and variables for this cohort are publicly available on the CPSP website, and other sensitive variables which we don't make public can be obtained through a data use agreement. The second cohort was recruited in 2015 and is the largest poverty tracker cohort. For the second cohort, we began interviewing respondents for up to 6 years, with the final surveys launching in 2023. There was a little bit of a delay with the pandemic, so that's why that field period goes beyond 6 years. And the sample size is just under 4,000 New Yorkers, which again is broken down between the main random digit dial sample of about 3,400 respondents and about 500 randomly selected social service participants. The first 4 years of the second cohort are available on the CPSP website as well, and the later waves can be requested. So I'm not going to go into all the details on the additional cohorts, but we have the third cohort, which is the first refresh sample, and it's a little bit smaller than the other cohorts because it's the goal is to have it as a refresh sample and supplement the main sample. We have the fourth cohort, which launched just around the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this includes about 2,000 New Yorkers. And more recently, we have the fifth cohort sampled in 2022. So these are used to supplement the main sample, but they also live on their own as analytic data sets that could be looked at longitudinally. And these later cohorts are not made public, but there's the potential for sharing them for interested researchers, either through a DUA or a similar process. And so here we just go over the survey schedule for cohort 1 to start. And so the general structure are annual surveys that collect our core measures on poverty, material hardship, and health problems, as well as data on housing and mental health and other topics. And we have our quarterly surveys, which happen after the annual surveys, about 3-month increments. And these surveys include all of the other topics mentioned, as well as shocks and some of our hardship measures as well. As I mentioned, with the second cohort, we began following New Yorkers for a longer period. And the structure follows the surveys follow the same main structure, with the annual surveys and the interim surveys happening in between the annual surveys. I should also mention that the annual surveys, many of the look back periods are 12-month look back period, and then within the annual surveys, they're often a 3-month look back period, but this varies depending on what the question is and the interests of the research. And so here we look at within this structure, the different topical modules and where they're asked in the survey schedule. This isn't exhaustive, and so you can look at the documentation we've shared that kind of details all the different modules and when they're asked and the different questions asked within those modules. But you can see the annual surveys have our core measures and some other measures as well. And the quarterly interim surveys have all of these different topics that we ask about. And then finally, we wanted to just give an example of how these different cohorts can be pulled together. This is one simple example of how the different cohorts can be pooled. But what we're showing here is, for example, if you take cohort 1 and cohort 2, they both have, the first 2 years of data, and you can pool the annual surveys together as well as the quarterly surveys, which ask the same topics. And you can look at, you can answer a research question using these pooled samples and increasing your sample size. So an example of how we've used this is to look at the experiences and shocks and how they're related to entrances into poverty. And so we'll look at poverty status at baseline and poverty status at the 12-month and the 24-month. And among those who are not originally in poverty at baseline, what's their likelihood of entering hardship in the subsequent wave, and then using the interim surveys to control for or look across the different experiences of shock that people face, and how those are related and predict entrances into poverty. And we've also done this for material hardship as well. I also just want to note this is just one way to pool the data. There are a lot of creative ways to pool the data, and we pool the data in other ways as well. And so I encourage you to reach out to our team if you have any questions about that, where the measures are asked, and how the data can be pulled together. And then also just generally, if you have any questions about the data, we have a really friendly team who work hard on the data, and we're happy to field any questions to make the data more usable among the research community.
So now I'm going to talk more about our imputation and weighting method. So before I dive in, I just want to talk about these two documents we've been working on. So one document is the technical notes. So it includes much more detail about the imputation and weighting method. And the other one is the guide for using poverty tracker weights. So that is a shorter version of guiding you how to use our available weights in the public data set. So feel free to refer to these documents, and also feel free to reach out if you have any questions to us. So it's very common to dealing with missingness in survey research. And like a lot of other surveys, we also have some missing data in our poverty tracker data. And that could be because of different reasons. For example, the respondent could be worried about the data security, or they could be uncomfortable of sharing some of the personal information. But in practice, it's not always ideal or impossible to go back, just survey those questions because of we have missing data. So in practice, a lot of times we do is we impute the missing data in the data. And that's a procedure called imputation. So what's imputation is, it's that a procedure we substitute missing information with an estimated value depending on another available information and data in the data set. With this imputation method, we would be able to preserve all the cases in our data so that we'll be able to analyze with all the data we collected. So then I will move on to talk about how the poverty tracker deals with missingness. So there's one very important underlying assumption that is missing at random. So what does that mean is that our missing values are missing at random, but not completely at random. I know that's confusing, but what that means is that when we are impute the missing values, we will be able to borrow information from other available data or characteristics from our own variables and to impute the missing values in our data. So we're not impute just purely by guessing, we're impute based on other available information in our data. So that's one very important assumption we have for the poverty tracker data. And the method we adopt here is the multiple imputation method. So there's the simple imputation method where it assumes the imputation is perfect. Like you impute one value and that value will be the perfect value for the missing replacement. But the method we adopt here is the multiple imputation, which incorporates the variability between imputations. So we take in mind that imputations are not perfect. There could be variabilities between different sets of imputations, and that's the method we adopted here. And yes, so there are a lot of different variables we impute for our analysis, and there are different types of variables we impute. So the first set of variables we impute are demographic variables, and they are from the baseline survey. So we impute variables such as education and immigration status, and then we impute variables for our core measures, which Matt just touched base on, and we impute those variables for both the baseline and post-baseline surveys. And those variables including the health variable, material hardship, income and expenses, and also housing variables. And besides that, we have to impute some variables because they are very important for our weighting procedure, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And for those variables, examples are like phone type, whether it's a cell phone user or landline user. And there's also the surveys use frequency variable, which we impute for the surveys use sample we have for cohort 1 and cohort 2. And we also do imputation for some other measures besides the core measure, and those are assets and debts imputation or variables, for example, and those are also available in our public data set. And that's all about the imputation happened in Poverty Tracker. So I'm going to pause for like 30 seconds or something. So if anyone has any like clarification questions, feel free, and we will have the longer Q&A at the end. I will take as a no. So let's continue to the weighting section. So before I jump into what we do for our weighting in Poverty Tracker, I just want to give a quick glance about what is a survey weight for those who are maybe less familiar with the concept. So a survey weight is a value that assigned to each case in the data, and it's normally used to adjust statistical parameters or estimators. So the inferences we made using the weighted data could be representative of the target population. So in this case, for example, what survey weights allows us to do is that we can, using our Poverty Tracker sample, to make statements about the New York City's population. And we could say, for example, what share of the New York City adults or household are in poverty, instead of just making statements or tell stories about the Poverty Tracker sample itself. And now I'm going to talk more detail about the weighting procedure in Poverty Tracker. So the survey weights are used to make sure, as I mentioned, our sample is representative of the New York City's adult population. And we use survey weights to account for oversampling, random over or undersampling, non-response, and attrition. For example, in the public data set, you might see a weight of 2000. And what that number means is that when you apply that weight to the respondent, that respondent will, the weighted respondent will be represented of 2000 of New Yorkers that share similar characteristics. So that's the magic of weighting. And to achieve this, we have several steps. So the first step we take is to adjust for sampling design. And the second step we take is to adjust for non-response, which we also call post-stratified to population. And the third step we have here is because we are a longitudinal study, and therefore we adjust for sample attrition over the years to create the longitudinal weights. And I will go more detail into each step. And for step one, adjust for sampling design. So we use design weights to adjust for sampling design, which compensate for over or under sampling of specific cases. So I will use an example from our fourth and fifth cohort Chinese oversample of Chinese New Yorkers. So for example, in our design, it might be the case that we oversample Chinese New Yorkers 4 times more than white New Yorkers. And that's because we want to be more representative of the Chinese New Yorkers. But that is not true in the population. So in order to adjust what happened in our sampling design, we need to use the design weights to account for that. And the design weights in Poverty Tracker adjust for different types of things. And the variables I listed here is mainly for our first and second cohort. So the first, we adjust for household size. So for example, when you imagine a household with more individuals in the household, they will be more likely to be sampled in our Poverty Tracker because there are more people and they could be more likely to be contacted. And in that way, we have to adjust for that. And we also have to adjust for phone availability. When you imagine a person with multiple cell phones for some reason, and then this person will be more likely to be sampled than the person with just one single cell phone in our sample. So we adjust for that too. And in our first cohort, we have the oversample for the household in high poverty neighborhoods, and we have to account that in our design weights. And the other thing we adjust is for the surveys use frequency. So that one we adjust because we have the surveys use sample, and people who are more frequently using the social services, they will be more likely to sample in our study. So we adjust for that too. And that is the design weights we use for the first step. And then we take another step, additional step, in addition to the design weights, which is we call the post-stratified to population. So what does that mean is it accounts for the fact that person with certain characteristics, they might be more likely to be sampled, to respond to a survey, and we need to correct for that effect. And for example, a very common fact in survey research is that you might see females are more likely to respond than males, right? But that's not actually the compensation in the population. They are pretty much the same share in the population. So that's why we want to post-stratify to population to account for that response pattern. So that's what we do in the second step. And the population data we use here is a 3-year American Community Survey for New York City adults. That's the population data we post-stratify to. And we post-stratify to a set of variables, including gender, age, education, race, ethnicity, number of children, number of seniors, number of working aged people, income to needs measure, and also interactions between some of the demographics and the income to needs measure to account for the dependencies between those variables. So that's the first and the second step, the design weights and the post stratification. So by combining the weights coming from these two steps, we get the baseline weights. So what the baseline weights does is that it helps us to ensure our baseline sample is representative of the New York City population in that baseline year. For example, for cohort 2, that is our sample. By using the weights, it will be representative of the New York City's population in 2015. So that's what step 1 and 2 does. And then we have the step 3 because we have a longitudinal design here. So we also adjust for post-baseline survey for attrition. So what our longitudinal weights is constructed using 2 different steps. The first step is using the baseline weights we just constructed by using step 1 and 2. And then we have a model to account for attrition over the year. So we use a logistic regression model to predict probability of responding, and that outcome of the model will be used as the attrition weight. So that's how we construct the longitudinal weights. So you will see not only the weights for the baseline, but also for the following waves, we also have weights associated with them. So after talking about so many technical things, now it's getting interesting because we're talking about how we're using poverty tracker weights. So here's a table with the example of how the weights are going to look like when you get the public data. So we have 2 different types of weights. We have the person level weights. We also have the poverty unit weights. So for those different weights, they could be used when you have different research questions and you want to generalize your research results to different population. So for example, if your research question is what % of adults in New York City experience poverty or hardship, then you will need to use the person level weights, Q weight P, because you are interested in the adults population, the individuals in New York City, right? But if your research question is more about what percentage of families or poverty unit in New York City is experience hardship, then you will use the poverty unit weight because your target population is the families or poverty units instead of the individuals. So there's different types of weights depending on your research question. And the last thing I want to mention is the replicant weights. So the replicant weights are currently available upon request. And we have this available if you are interested to make more precise confidence interval or statistical estimates or tests. So we have those replicant weights available for both the person level weights and the poverty unit weights. And more details about how to use the replicant weights and what does they do can be found in the documents I mentioned. So that's all about our imputation and weighting. And based on the time, I will not pause here, but I will pass it to Skylar.
All right. So we've spent all morning learning about poverty tracker and sort of different studies that have been done over the years, different research findings that come out of it. And then Matt talked all about sort of the history of our study and the structure and what it measures over time. And Yajun talked about the weights. So is everyone feeling excited about the poverty tracker? Yes? Okay, so I'm here, my name's Skylar Ross. I'm the data manager here at CPSP. I'm here to tell you, now that you're all jazzed about the project, how you can actually access the data for the project. Because it's one thing that we collect all this data and then we're able to use it to produce reports, but it becomes infinitely more valuable if we're able to get it out in the world and people are able to ask questions that we never thought of or use methods, that didn't occur to us. So there's like two types of data that you can get your hands on. There's data that we've already made public, like posted on our website, available to the public. And then there's data that's available by request or like sensitive data. So I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. So first, the public data. So a lot of the data we've collected over the years is already on our website available to the public. So we have everything from the first panel, that's from 2012 to 2014. And then we have the first 4 years of data from our second panel from 2015 to 2019. And if any of you went on our website in the past and registered to use the data, you would have seen only the first 2 years of our second panel. Just today, we posted 2 more years, so from 2017 to 2019. And then we post the data and associated resources in similar formats for both cohorts. So you can see data files that are in Stata and CSV. This Stata file includes our variable and value labels. So you may want to download that even if you're going to load it into another language like R or Python. We also post our full survey questionnaires. So you can see exactly what was asked to people in what order. And then we post code books, and the code book is just a list of all the different variables and the answer options. And for our imputed variables, we have a little explanation of how they're calculated. Yeah. So now I'll just walk you through briefly how you can actually get our data. What's the process look like? Okay, so step 1, go to our website and you go to specifically this page, our data launch page. Then step 2, you go to the bottom and you click on register the data for new users. Step 3, you fill out this fancy form. It's actually not that fancy. It's just what's your name? Where are you from? What do you want to do with the data? And then agreeing not to try to de-identify or try to identify anyone in it. Step 4 will give you a password, which you'll forget, and then you'll email me asking for the password, but we'll give you a password. Step 5, you will be taken to our data portal page. So it looks like this. It actually doesn't look exactly like this because we now updated it to have a little more data, but you can see 2 cohorts and different the different resources that I mentioned for each of them. And then there's a bonus, step 6. If you don't forget the password, you can, in the future, if you want to re-register, go to returning users, click login, just enter your password. And you don't have to fill out a form if you want to download the data multiple times in the future. Yeah, so that's the process for our public data. Now, there's also restricted use data or sensitive data. So we collect more data than we actually publish online. And the reason is that some of the variables we collect, we decide that we don't feel comfortable posting online. They could compromise our subjects' confidentiality. So these include things like non-top coded income. So in our public data sets, we take like the top 10% of income or rent values, and we top code them, so we hide them. Geographic indicators, so like the data that Ethan mentioned, using about zip code or census tract, we don't just publish that online. Things like open-ended text responses, so we ask questions like, we might say, did you seek help with X issue? And then we'll ask a follow-up like, why didn't you receive help? And people will enter things, and we don't publish that online because it's just textual data. And then other things that we've deemed sensitive, so like sexual orientation, immigration status, and immigration history, and then precise salary and wage amounts. So all of this is what we would call like sensitive or restricted use. That does mean, as I said, we don't just post it on the website, but it doesn't mean that you can't get your hands on it if you have a research project that you think would benefit from using any of this. So if you want to get your hands on our restricted use data, there's a few steps you can follow. The first one is just tell us. You can, when you fill out that form to register for the public data, you might mention that you're interested in some other variables. We actually do read the form responses. Or you can email us. We have a general email here, povertytracker@columbia.edu. And just let us know a little bit about, what you're interested in, both your research project and maybe what variables you'd like to see. The next step, there's two step ones. Well, okay. The second step one is you set up a meeting with a member of the team, probably with me, and yeah, we can just discuss some details, what your timeline's like, some next steps. The third step is to obtain approval from the project directors. They'll just, green light, okay, this, seems legitimate. This seems like a good reason to give out some of this data that we try to protect. And then the fourth step or third step on this slide is to submit a data usage agreement, or DUA. That's something you heard Matt referencing earlier. Okay, so what is this mysterious DUA? Well, it's a collection, a packet of these 7 things. So you can see research abstract, supplemental agreements, copies of CVs. So a couple things on this. One is this might not seem like it's super fun, and not all of it is super fun. But the reason that we have so many components of this is that we want to ensure that we protect our subjects' identities and protect the integrity of our data. So we really take that seriously in our study. We put a lot of thought into crafting all these components, and we believe that each one is necessary. Now, the other thing is that this might seem intimidating and like there's a ton of stuff. Most of these are just like forms that you have to sign. I've highlighted the 3 big ones here. So the sort of substantive elements are you'd give us an extended research abstract. There's just a couple of paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining in more detail what you want to do, why you want sensitive variables. Then there's a restricted use data protection plan. So you detail how you're going to protect our sensitive data. If we're giving you zip codes, how are you going to store this data? How are you going to ensure that this doesn't just, get out to everyone and everyone knows our subject zip codes? And finally, you'd need proof of IRB approval from your own institution. So this will get signed off by Columbia's IRB, but you'd also need another IRB to approve it. If you're with like a government organization or with an academic institution, you might have an IRB you could go to. If you're not, if you're an independent researcher, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a journalist, there are also sort of independent external IRB-like organizations that you could use. And finally, do not worry, we're here to help. So if you have questions about any of this, we'll guide you through the process. We've done it numerous times with different researchers, and once you get into it, it's not that intimidating. Okay, so that's accessing our data, public data, restricted data. And the final thing I just want to talk about is our new public resources. The fireworks, because we're all so excited that we publish them. So all of these, well, actually the first 4 were just released today. published on the website. The 5th one is coming soon. I think next week is our goal to get that out. We're just making sure it's super perfect right now. So we have the first 2 you actually got copies of, the 2-page overview of the poverty tracker, then our comprehensive, 20-page guide to the study. We also have, as Yajun mentioned, supplemental guide to using the weights. We have a technical appendix on imputation and weighting. Goes into more detail on what Yajun explained in her presentation. And then the last one, which is, again, probably going to be released next week. The most exciting one is what we're calling our question library. So question library, it's like one of the greatest Excel sheets ever created, in our opinion. And what this is, historically, we posted all this data on our websites, and these are really, really long data sets, right? So we have all these survey waves, all these variables, and sometimes we'll get emails from researchers like, I want to look at education. What do I do? Like there's a million variables. So we thought it would be a good idea to sort of create a database that could help you navigate that. So this is going to be like an Excel workbook or Google Sheet type workbook that has all of the questions asked across all of our public waves. So everything from 2012 to 2019. And we organize it by both survey waves, so you can see sort of, where different questions are asked over time, and also by topic. So if you are that education researcher and you want to, what did they ask about education and where, you can just look at our education category and see every question we asked, what the answer options are, and where it was asked before you even dig into the data. So yeah, that's the question library. And that's all I've got. Yeah, so I think final slide, just some contact info for the future.